Sorry, I muted myself by accident. No, I was just basically asking about like the DNA, and I know you said that you were concerned about it in the past. Is there the possibility of it being transferred there somehow? It was single source DNA inside the button snap. What made you change your mind that it could have been transferred there by some other means?
Under or next to a victim who was bleeding out.
Believe it or not, I believed Brian, so I believed his attorney when she said, how would she say, hundreds of law enforcement officers that were in and out of that place or something like that?
Yeah.
That any single one of them could have transferred this DNA from somewhere else. I know many people believe that Brian Kohberger did not have an Instagram. That's cool. But when I saw after Brian Kohberger in the seconds after the Moscow Police Department announced his name, there was absolutely an Instagram. It was connected to the two girls. So I kept telling myself that if he knew these two girls, then that would make sense. His DNA could be anywhere. He literally could have given one of them a ride, and maybe there was no one that, left that knows that. There are a million ways that Brian could have known someone, interacted with someone, anything. And he also could have simply been the DoorDasher, right? And he also could have simply been the DoorDasher, right? And he also could have simply been the DoorDasher, right? So does he leave the food, and then one of these officers collects the DoorDash, collects the sheath, and then they go and process it later, and Brian's DNA has now been transferred from the DoorDash to the sheath? There's so much so for me, it was definitely his DNA, and it was just a matter of how it got there.
Yeah. I understand that aspect. That also went through my mind as well. I was like, this guy's a teaching assistant in a criminal justice class. Is it possible that he has access to those that have to persons who have access to the criminal lab, or police officers that do? Those things went through my mind, and then you find out that he puts himself out and about in a secluded area, according to himself, in his car. It's not like, for instance, I know a lot of folks bring up this one case where this guy's DNA was under the fingernails of a dead guy and it got there because apparently he touched the doorknob that a paramedic touched the same doorknob who ended up going and assisting with this dead person. The problem is Brian Kohberger wasn't near anybody that night, according to himself. He was secluded. He was by himself. He was in his vehicle. And I'm going to think that if he is innocent in this whole glove situation, it would have been something that he'd been doing beforehand. I mean, police literally tried to get his DNA for days, couldn't do so. They ended up having to, be left with his father's DNA to do the comparison. And
except they didn't know who he was until December 23rd or December 20th, according to Payne.
Cold, icy night,
right?
That his DNA just so happened to get on the knife sheath that was being transported by a guy who matches more or less Brian Kohberger's height and weight. That his DNA just so happened to get on the knife sheath that was being transported by a guy who matches more or less Brian Kohberger's height and weight. Also drives a vehicle very similar to his, without a front license plate. And is doing this while Brian Kohberger is, self-adamantly put himself
appears to not have a front license plate. Doesn't mean it didn't have
evidence of where he was. And so, interesting stuff there. Now, I know you mentioned it, and we'll kind of get into some of those things, but you mentioned the DoorDash driver, and I know that you mentioned the I think I can't remember Twilio number. The only thing that my question comes up is,
this is the best part right here.
Maybe there's the possibility that Brian Kohberger was a DoorDasher. Is that true?
Yeah. So I used to believe that maybe he could have been the DoorDasher, and then I let it go. But then I found the Twilio number, and it just reignited it. So this is
the best part.
Yeah. Well, just I don't think so, just because it says in the PCA that the DoorDash delivery drivers reported the information about the DoorDash delivery. So I don't even think
no serial killer goes out when it's cold.
The DoorDasher came full.
So she's saying that Brian was the DoorDash driver.
Mm-hmm.
But the DoorDash driver reported delivering food to the house that night. Why didn't they start looking at Brian as a suspect until December 20th then? I mean, he reported himself to the police saying he dropped off food at the house. They would have known the car. They would have known the time he was there. They just didn't look at him?
I understand as far as when we get to 2013, but when we go beyond that, what did you rely on to get beyond that?
It would have been his input as an expert in vehicle identification. That's what we relied on.
Part of your affidavit talks about WSU officers finding white Elantras. And I believe there was an officer that you had some communication with. Do you recall the date you had that communication?
I do not recall the date. No.
Did you have some messaging system exchange with this officer to talk about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that the only means of communication you had with this officer?
No, ma'am. I believe I spoke to him on the telephone as well.
When you spoke to him on the telephone, how did that relate to the date of the messaging?
It would have likely been, if memory serves, it would likely been that same day.
Okay. Does December 20th, 2022 sound familiar to you?
Yes, ma'am.
And so this conversation with this officer from Washington, it related backwards to when he noticed an Elantra. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
But when he noticed it, you didn't know about that yet. Is that also correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so you don't know about him or talk to him until December 20th, 2022, correct?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
In your affidavits, did you rely on cell phone information and cell phone location information?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you work with cell phone records yourself?
No, ma'am.
Did you see cell phone records yourself?
Yes, ma'am. I did.
When was the first time you saw cell phone records that were attributed to Brian Kohberger?
I do not remember what date that was.
Well, maybe you can give me an estimate. We know on the 20th, you're talking to WSU about an observation from a month before. And we know on December 23rd, you're asking for AT&T warrants for information. Can you narrow
That's
it down?
yes.
Sorry, Judge.
That's a yes. You can, I just want to get the record. Yes.
Yes, that's
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
So between those 2 days, does that help you identify the first time you saw cell phone records related to Brian Kohberger?
Memory serves, the first time I saw any cell phone records related to Brian Kohberger was after we received the return from the first search warrant.
Just to be sure I'm tracking with you, when you say the return from the first search warrant, we're talking about the first AT&T warrant.
Yes,
Is
ma'am.
that right?
That's correct.
And in that warrant, you were seeking 48 hours worth of records. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So if I call those the 48-hour records, we'll both be on the same page?
Yep.
All right. You wrote your second AT&T warrant for a much longer period of phone records that same day, December 23rd, correct?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
And remember, he brought hamburgers.
It is what it is. When in your coverage, or well, did you have Forensic Frenzy as a channel when Brian Kohberger was arrested, or did that come a little bit afterwards?
So when Brian Kohberger was arrested, I was actually I was Forensic Frenzy on Twitter, right? So I wasn't here. I wasn't in this space.
Gotcha.
But the first 8 months, until about August of 2023, I had held on to some of my discrepancies that I had from the PCA. Okay. And I was listening to Brian when he said that he was eager to be exonerated and, you know, things like that. And again, on the surface, now looking back, I know I was wrong. So on the surface, he doesn't look like the kind of person that would be like on the internet arguing with anyone, but evidently he may be that kind of person. And, you know, so now looking back, it's like, you may have let the actual being misconstrue your judgment. And, you know, so now looking back, it's like, you may have let the actual being misconstrue your judgment. So I think that for a very long time, I just looked at the person and I literally could not let it go. And then he was saying things like, I'm eager to be exonerated. So I couldn't let it go. I actually did believe that they had the wrong person. I thought that there had to have been some kind of overlap, connection, something that would explain DNA being in the home and then possibly being transferred to the sheath. I went through all the things that everyone else did. So when people tell me that I'm a guilter and that I don't understand where the Brian Kohberger is innocent crowd comes from, I literally laugh because I actually was a part of that crowd. So it's literally, I can't even argue with someone who's less fortunate than to know, but I was a part of that crowd. So I held on when he told us that he had an alibi. I listened when he said that he was going to prove that he was somewhere else. I understood when he said that he was going to provide witnesses as well as cross-examine witnesses, and I was still holding on. But I think it was sometime around the waiver of speedy trial that Brian lost me. I just felt like if he had been innocent like he told me, I just felt like if he had been innocent like he told me, I just felt like if he had been innocent like he told me, that there was no way that he was going to waive his right to a speedy trial. They clearly didn't have everything that they needed at that time to convict him, and it would have been a very advantageous point to try to take it to trial and know that they were not going to be prepared. So he lost me there. A couple months later, November 23, I started my channel. And by then I had already been speaking with literally whoever would speak, including any neighbor that was like an actual permanent residential neighbor and had nothing to do with the college out there. So at that point, I was pretty well and convinced through not just Brian's own actions, but some, or inactions in court, I guess, but some of the other things that he was probably at least involved. I started my channel with, was he simply just an accomplice? My channel has, if you were ever there in the beginning and you're here now watching this, then you know that my channel has changed its mind. I started with, was he the accomplice? Then I transformed into, okay, is there an accomplice and he's the freaking mastermind? Like, what is going on? I've been lost this whole time, right along with you guys. And probably, I don't know, January 24, my channel started being noticed by other people. I got in with some creators who were able to reach like families and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I first contacted GARRETT Discovery back in April of this year that I actually spoke to any families or anything like that. So I had been well and convinced, as well as pushing it on my YouTube channel, that Brian Kohberger was more than likely guilty long before I actually started speaking to the families, based off his own actions or inactions, whichever you want to call them, and coupled with some of the things that I was digging out of the documents.
No, I understand all that. For me, the phone, his phone activity, the fact that he turned it off or wasn't connected to the towers during that specific hour, on an icy cold, cloudy night, on an icy cold, cloudy night, on an icy cold, cloudy night. freezing temperatures. It was below freezing. And, you know, his phone was off. It was the biggest thing that held me to, I thought he had more than likely did something in this case early on. You know, the DNA.
Can I just play off that super quick before I forget? I don't have an iPhone. It is a really expensive phone, but it's not an iPhone. I have an Android. And at 3 a.m., my phone, I can turn it off, but I don't. At 3 a.m., my phone resets. And any updates that need to happen. And it doesn't turn back on until it's done. So I was a little suspicious of the phone being off, but I remained aware of that. And it did play a role in why I believed him at first.
Got you. Yeah, for me, I just thought that was too big of a coincidence